All right, aloha students. Nice to see you all as always. Great to be here with you. Thank you for watching. This is sort of a continuation, obviously a continuation of the Modern World History class. We're going to talk about the tumultuous 1960s and many of the highlights of something called the Great Society. That was one of the major, really one of the major governmental projects that expanded the federal government really in American history. And you see, I think you'll see you'll see a number of things today that even though these were started in the 1960s, they are still very much with us today. So let's get started. You know, the 1960s, all the many controversies of the things that happened then, starting with the Kennedy administration. His assassination, maybe you recall the assassination discussion we had in world history class. But of course, when Kennedy was assassinated, his vice president took over as president of the United States. And this was a man named Lyndon Baines Johnson, mostly sort of known in American history as LBJ. That was always, there's several sort of modern presidents who we just sort of go by their initials, the FDR, JFK, and LBJ is sort of the third one of those. Anyway, so Johnson takes over in obviously November 1963. He runs for re-election in November 64. He wins. Recall, please, he was a senator from the state of Texas, Southern Democrat. And so now here we are, January 1965, and he has just been reelected, handily, I might add. And now it's time for him, he thinks, to do something serious. So he comes up with this thing called the Great Society. That's what it's known as. And this is what I am sort of defining as federal legislation that focuses on his domestic agenda. This is going to really sort of focus on civil rights, welfare, social programs, etc., as you can see. LBJ. So January 1965, he has just been reelected, has had his his first inauguration, of course, is when he originally becomes president. It's after the assassination of JFK. So it's his first inauguration. Now he's in office, and he is going to roll with it. Okay, so this is sometimes referred to as New Deal 2. Now I hope you remember this. If you don't know what this is, go back to the FDR movie, and you can watch that discussion. And the New Deal were domestic federal legislation to deal with the Great Depression of the 1930s, and that was all called the New Deal. And maybe you recall the first 100 days of FDR's administration and the alphabet soup of acronyms of all the programs that were started during that time. So sometimes this is called New Deal 2. So now let's just go through some of these examples of things that were passed during this time, and I think most of you are probably hip and clued into the fact that this is a time of civil rights, and the civil rights movement is a major aspect of the 1960s. So much of the civil rights legislation that happened at this time. Now there was a civil rights act, if you will, that was passed in 1957 during the Eisenhower administration. So this is not necessarily the first one. You might say, well, this is 1964. You said 1965. Look, the Johnson administration and the JFK administration had been working on these things. There was a lot of it was bipartisan, but it was contentious. I will agree with all that. You may have heard of, I'm sure you've heard of all the stories of the problems of segregation, particularly in the southern states, the discrimination against African Americans during these times. From things as simple as separate restrooms to really sort of silly things like ridiculous things like separate water fountains, etc. Those things were banned by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. There were some trickier things like segregation of schools. Was that going to continue? Was that going to change? Those were some of the major things. This also had to do with fair hiring practices is one of the major aspects of that part. There's an element that goes along with this is the Voting Rights Act of 1865. This is another thing really sort of to end, again, ideas of trying to prohibit people from getting to the polls because of their race, et cetera, et cetera. These types of things were critical at that time. Let's talk about welfare types of legislation. Okay, so remember now, I'm calling this civil rights, welfare, social legislation. Okay, so I'm trying to give you those things in the same order: civil rights legislation, welfare types of legislation. Okay, so here's something I bet you've heard of: Medicare. Medicare is with us still to this very day. Medicare, the idea behind Medicare was to help the elderly. Sort of in the same way that the New Deal came up with this idea. The New Deal came up with this idea of helping elderly people through the Social Security Act of the New Deal. Here you have Medicare. And we see most all Americans really are dealing with their health care through Medicare in some way, shape, or form, whether they still have a remaining health plan through their former employer or whatever, private health care. Medicare is a major aspect and a critical aspect to many people, really most people over the age of 65. You may have heard of Medicaid. This is also something that came about at this time. This is basically the same thing. However, this is for people who are under 65. 65 is sort of this nebulous number that we sort of throw around about retirement age. It's basically a number that affects law. Obviously, you can retire before 65, you can retire after 65, but as far as law goes, 65, and that number has sort of moved over the years, moved up every single time, based on the law, changing the laws, I should say. Anyway, Medicaid is for people who are under the retirement age, who are, for whatever reason, on assistance, perhaps because of losing their job, getting injured, those types of things. Medicaid exists for them. Maybe you've heard of HUD. This is something also that is very important. It's the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Something very important, sort of if you recall the Progressive Movement movie, that's just a recent episode. You recall that the progressives, and you can see that this is there's a lot of big government, federal government stuff here. So you can see this is a very liberal, sort of progressive kind of concept, isn't it? Remember, Johnson is a Democrat, okay? So you recall the progressive movement. There was a lot of discussion about how progressives really wanted to emphasize the cities, the big cities. Maybe you've heard of the Economic Opportunity Act. Maybe you've heard of Head Start. Maybe you were a kid in Head Start. Maybe you've heard of Job Corps. Certainly we have, I'm sure you have maybe heard of, I'm sure you've heard of food stamps. Those types of things all came about at this time period to further help those who are in difficult situations, sometimes for young people, sometimes for adults. All right. How about education legislation? So this is sort of more of along the social aspect of the first thing I sort of talked about, the social legislation. Let's start with the Education Act of 1965. This was an attempt to send some money to what were considered the poorest school districts in America. Many of them in inner cities as well, in the big cities, many times in inner cities as well. But it could be also sent to rural areas. That was the idea behind it. But it was to get more money to the schools that needed it. With that came the Higher Education Act, which as I'm sure you can imagine, this has to do with college assistance. Okay? The Higher Education Act of 1965. So, again, federal involvement in education from K through college graduation. Alrighty. How about another one of note? Something you may have heard of. This is why I included it. Maybe you've heard of the National Endowment of the Arts. It's really called the National Endowment to the Arts and Humanities. Sometimes when I'm watching PBS, Public Broadcasting Service, I hear they have a little snippet in there about the National Endowment of the Arts and how that is something that helps PBS. Okay, so that's sort of an idea. Maybe you can connect those two things right there. You should note there were numerous aspects of environmental acts that go along with this. So again, you kind of see how sort of talked about different sides of the political spectrum, certainly over the course of these two courses, haven't I? So you can see that this is sort of a demonstration of the liberal progressive agenda when they get a chance to govern. Okay, so now what's the importance? Well, I think obviously the most important thing is that you should recognize some of these things that I'm talking about here today certainly are still with us today. Okay, so let's go through this. What I would say is, number one, that this is something that was not just decided after he got reelected. He'd been thinking about this. One of Johnson's most famous speeches of his presidency was before Congress, and he said he wanted it to be like FDR's declaration of war against Japan back in 1941. Johnson's speech was, "We declare war on poverty." All right, and so we, meaning the federal government, we're going to declare war on poverty. And we're going to further increase the role of the federal government in the attempt to alleviate poverty in the country. So this is not something that is just brand new that he thought of in his second, sort of, if you will, his second, after his re-election. All right, as I mentioned a moment ago, and this is an element of the progressives, as I mentioned a moment ago as well, a lot of these are directed towards the inner cities. This is the direction that these ideas are going. All right? So this is a super important part to keep in mind when you think about this. One of the things that I would say also sort of was influenced by this is that African Americans had historically in America leaned Republican. Now, why were African Americans leaning Republican? Well, it has to do with Abraham Lincoln. And of course, Abraham Lincoln was perceived, rightly so, by African Americans for most of American history as the guy who freed the slaves. All right? So therefore, African Americans voted Republican because of Abe Lincoln. We see a big change in that. It wasn't overwhelmingly Republican, but was majority of Republican, I would say, but we've seen a big swing in that ever since the Great Society to African Americans voting Democrat. And now we see that typically presidential elections, African Americans vote anywhere from only 10 to 20% on the Republican side, overwhelmingly to the Democrat side. Those dynamics and those types of things could be shifting, but the fact still remains, I think, that this is something that we must take a look at and believe has to do with the Great Society. Okay? There's something looming over LBJ's head all during this time. Okay? He really wants this to be his signature thing, his main thing that his legacy revolves around. All right? But there's something swirling over his head that he is very worried about, and ultimately probably, I think the Great Society is probably LBJ's legacy. Some would argue for good, some would argue for ill. But frankly, LBJ has another legacy as well, and that is the Vietnam War. And so he was always very worried and understood that the Great Society was going to be expensive. And so he was going through this difficulty of government domestic spending on the Great Society, along with government spending, basically foreign policy. The Cold War had spilled in Vietnam, and he was left with he was left with a lot of this. He certainly escalated the American involvement in the Vietnam War. And you would discover if you study LBJ, he decides not to run for re-election in 1968, really because of the burdens of the Vietnam War. There's a very famous speech you can find of him, and he says, "I will not seek, nor will I accept my party's nomination for President of the United States." He says that in 1968. Okay? Okay, so one of the things we should sort of say is, okay, since the Great Society, what has happened? Has these things been successful? Well, there are estimates out there that basically in the last almost 60 years, the United States has spent about $20.7 trillion on means-tested aid. Now, what does this mean? Well, means-tested sort of means aid that goes to people who meet some sort of litmus test about where they are in society. Are they at the poverty level, around it, underneath it? We test that. We base it on a number that the federal government deems to equal the poverty rate. If somebody is near there or on there or under there, they are eligible for some kind of aid. That's the best way for me to describe it. So we're talking about almost 60 years here. That's a lot of money in 60 years. So now, has it worked? Well, let's just say this. Okay, poverty rates did fall during the 1960s slightly. All right. Now there is some debate about that. There's some discussion that JFK. Many students are surprised when I tell you this. JFK was a big tax cutter, even though he was a Democrat. One of the biggest tax cuts in American history was under JFK. So some argue, well, the cutting of taxes by the Kennedy administration at the very beginning of the 60s is what helped poverty rates fall during the 1960s. Others say, hey, no, it's the Great Society that all this federal government assistance coming in and helps everybody. That's what caused poverty rates to fall during the 1960s. But the fact of the matter is they rose again. And even more so, and I think students are even more surprised by this, is that generally America's poverty rate has really been the same. It definitely went down in the 80s, for example, when there was a lot less spending on government social programs. America's poverty rate has stayed basically between 12 and 15% for 60 years. So therefore, I think there is a debate to be had. What's the best way to do it? We see. You can make the argument that poverty rates have fallen in different administrations, both Republican and Democrat, etc. If you are further interested in this discussion, one of the things that I think is very good to look at, if you are interested in this subject, go watch LBJ's speech to Congress where he outlines his Great Society. It's probably about 9 or 10 minutes long, and I would just put that into the YouTube search. It's black and white, okay? And he gets to the point where he just makes a list of 9 proposals. And one of the things that's very interesting to listen to that list and sort of think about as he's talking about his ideas, many of which you'll hear in there that are loosely referenced to some of the exact things I've listed for you earlier in this discussion. How does the federal government take care of some of these proposals? How is it possible to measure whether the federal government has done a good job at achieving or almost achieving the proposals he's making? So I think you would find that very fascinating. So take a look at that. And yeah, I think that would be a good way to sort of finish off the discussion of the Great Society. Okay, everyone, so there you have it. Certainly one of the really influential federal government aspects, programs in American history. And again, here we are talking about the mid-1960s, and here we are, like I said, almost 60 years on from it. Really influential, no doubt about it. And again, the debate, whether for good or ill, that's up to you. But I think no doubt, no disputing the fact, the influence of a great society. Okay? All right. Very good. Thank you. Like I said, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for checking it out. And I will talk to you next time. Aloha.